the role of probabilistic demand planning in resilient supply chains. I spoke about probabilistic forecasting and planning in our PRISM session, and didn't quite explain then how this impacts what we're dealing with today. And as I listened in on some of the earlier topics. It's a little early for me here in the United States, so I didn't get to see everything. But I think the message that the world is changing, that the customer is changing, was a common theme. Basically, supply chains are globalizing, product portfolios are proliferating. This causes an enormous fragmentation of the data that we have to deal with as demand planners. There's the Amazon effect, where everyone wants their product today or tomorrow, and this is putting a pressure on every other manufacturer and distributor as well to provide similar service. And this causes another refinement in time. So another granularity increase, if you will. And then finally, there's a lot of volatility in the market that wasn't there, and that's increasing. All of these combine to basically require our demand plans to be in a finer granularity and a higher frequency. And an immediate consequence of that is that demand patterns that used to be smooth become highly intermittent. And all the traditional approaches to that don't like intermittency. Even the way we measure problems don't like intermittency. And so what we really need is algorithms that can actually deal properly with that. Now, this is just the normal patterns that occur and have been occurring for the last decades. But additionally, as we've noticed this year, on top of that, there's disruptions. So when people ask, how do we become resilient? If you'd asked that question last year, it's about all that normal stuff, all that the green stuff on my screen that you see. When we talk about that today, people are like, how do we deal with the pandemic? What happens if in another territory that we serve, there's another huge spike? What do we do with that? So these are a special kind of disruptions that are above and beyond the normal resiliency, and both of them actually require a different type of response, if you will. So if we look at just that resiliency for the day-to-day type, the non-COVID-19 type disruptions, already we've seen that the traditional solutions have stopped working. So in this old way of looking at forecasting and planning, we try to aggregate data to a nice high level because the patterns are smoother, because noise gets reduced and it's easy to fit curves through it. Then once we use that to create a forecast or a plan and we need to act on it, then we split it down from the top to whatever granularity we need. And there's a problem there in that there's not one unique way that you can split a number. And so we use all kinds of rules. And in practice, what we find is that even if you have a pretty good forecast accuracy at a high level, once you split it down, it becomes really bad. Some typical numbers that we've seen here is where maybe an accuracy of 80% at a high level turns to an accuracy of 20–25% once you split it down. So it's a tremendous loss of accuracy. And then at that bottom level where we're actually using the numbers, we're giving them as exact numbers, which is very precise. And everyone will be readily admitting that those numbers are typically wrong. So what we have to do is shift the way we work. And the new way is we need to actually go into that detail at a fine granularity in all dimensions, time and product and location. And instead of fitting curves through it, which is really difficult, you want to fit probability distributions, which it doesn't really matter what the shape is, if it's intermittent or not. You can always fit a distribution through it. And then you want to use it at a level where you can interact with it. People don't like to, to be down in the weeds. They like to see the plans at a higher level and maybe drill down when they see an issue or something that spikes their interest. So you sum it up, and there's only one way to do it. So you don't introduce any new issues by going that way. And ultimately, what you end with is at any level of aggregation, whether that's monthly, weekly, daily, whether it's at a SKU level, SKU location, or product family, or an account level, you end up with distributions. And these distributions, of course, are kind of vague. They're not an exact number, so they're not precise. But if done well, they can be extremely accurate. And that's really the shift that we need to do from being precise to being accurate. So how does that look? I can imagine a lot of people have not seen a probabilistic forecast. So just to give you a glance, on the left is your typical statistical, where you basically, on the green being the monthly history and the red being a forecast, monthly numbers, and they're what's called a single point forecast on the top. Every month you predict exactly one number for each item, each location if required, and potentially you can provide confidence intervals around that. And when we provide a forecast based on confidence limits to downstream planning processes, it's often called a range forecast. So a range forecast is not yet probabilistic. If you look on the right here, we see here a weekly historical demand pattern in the green bars, but now on the right, there's a representation of the uncertainty around that forecast. And you still have your line. So if you really want one number, you can still get it. But what you're much more interested in terms of resiliency is these distributions on the right, and you can tell that every month has different levels of uncertainty indicated by these shades. So it's not a single distribution that's homogeneous over time. Every single time period, whether that's a day or a week or a month, doesn't matter, will have its own distribution, just like a forecast that's built in a statistical way, but a little bit more advanced. So the colors that were shown, there's a simple way of showing it. In this case, it was the equivalent of 1, 2, and 3 sigma, but it could have been quantiles or percentiles or whatever you want, just for visibility purposes. But what you might have noticed is that the top end of those blue bars were much longer than the shorter end. And that really is indicating that the distribution that we have determined behind the scenes is not symmetrical. So if we again compare the probabilistic to the statistical view of the world, in the statistical view, our main objective is to determine the average quantity. And in a forecast, what we then do is we say, well, what is the variance around that? And assuming that there's an unbiased normal distribution, we can determine what the residual error is. And so that error is indicated here in that blue symmetrical curve. The probabilistic view of the world, both in forecast and in plans, is that the average doesn't matter. No company ever got into trouble when the average situation occurred. What matters is when we get an extremely low or an extremely high demand situation. So if you get those right, you can deal with issues much more accurately with regards to service level and with regards to obsolescence. So why can you not do that with the normal distribution? Well, first of all, here in this area on the left, that's negative demand. There's no such thing as negative demand, right? At best, you can have a separate forecast for returns versus original demand. But what some companies do, combining them, they get something similar to negative demand. That's actually very, very difficult to deal with in reality, and it's not a real pattern. It's an artifact. But barring that situation, every one of these demand forecasts with a normal distribution has a tail that goes down to negative infinity. And there will be some part of it that will be assumed to be negative. So if we ignore that, because that can't happen in practice, what you really get is a bias variability assessment. You put that into your supply chain, you're going to get bad effects. On the other side, we're underestimating how good the demand could be, how high it could be. And the effect of that is that if you were to put this result of this blue curve into, say, a safety stock formula, that you're going to be targeting service levels that you could never achieve, not theoretically, and certainly not practically. You're never going to achieve those service levels. And in the old days, and now maybe in your today in your highest volume goods, that might be a shortfall of maybe anywhere between 0 and 3% that you're getting wrong simply by getting the distribution wrong. But once you move to your medium movers and your slower movers, you're going in the range of maybe 10 to 20% drop of service level. If you're targeting 95, you can achieve only 75, just because you're assuming that distribution. But more important, I think, for our topic today is that if we want to capture resilience, we have to get this tail right? And in the most common day-to-day data, that tail will be short. But those disruptions that we're talking about, what they tend to do is they tend to make that tail long. And if we can't capture how long that tail gets, then we have no way of providing a plan that allows us to be resilient for disruptions in the future. Now, this sounds maybe really good, and it may make you feel like we can capture anything. Reality is that these distributions are determined based on historical data. So if you go back 5 years with historical data, you can capture anything in that tail that happened in the last 5 years. Now, if you consider the coronavirus pandemic, the last time that happened was 102 years ago, to this magnitude. So if we wanted to have been prepared and known that this could happen, and then still we'd have to make our planning decisions whether we'd want to respond to that, we would have had to go at least 102 years back with our history of data to actually capture and extend that tail a little further, or maybe a lot further than we would have without that data. So that's the caveat between, and why I made the distinction earlier on. There is the resiliency against things that occur relatively commonly. Maybe an economic recession happens every 10 years. Well, that's still within the realm of possible. We get miniature little epidemics every once in a while. The flu strikes much harder than other years. We can still capture that. But if we want to capture the truly once in 100-year type of event, we really need more than 100 years worth of data, whether that's a major earthquake or a pandemic, right? So that's a big caveat. So the distributions based on the historic data in the forecast can only take you so far, cannot take you there all the way. So the demand plan then builds on that forecast. So the forecast, if you imagine we're providing distributions, the forecast has to combine a lot of different things. There's the baseline, there's a trend. A trend is not just a line. A trend is a waiver of potential future directions. Maybe there's a chance that it will go up. Maybe there's a chance it will level. Maybe it will. There's a chance it will go down. There's a wave of possible futures. Same thing with seasonality, the recurring patterns, and any external events, like maybe there's promotions that you run, maybe there's something that your competitor does, maybe there's a hurricane that's being predicted, and people start stocking up on water or wooden boards to protect their homes and stores. Those types of things your forecast already provides. If the data is there, it will provide it. So it has a way of combining that into an overall distribution. The same thing we now do on the demand plan. So the demand plan, we add stuff like the sales input. And a sales manager might know that the customer is opening new stores, or maybe they're closing stores, or maybe he's made some kind of deal that it's not in the system. The demand plan can add it. Same thing with the budget, compare the gaps in what you want to do with what the forecast says that's most likely to happen. Account planning, and of course scenario planning. So in scenario planning, this is our bucket for where we could potentially cover for a pandemic. We can add information into the plan or into the forecast because we expect that something major is going to happen. Maybe the virus has already struck in China, and now we know that it's likely that it's going to strike in India, or it's going to strike in the United States, and we're going to add a scenario to adjust that forecast. And again, as an output of that, we get distributions. So this is the whole premise of a probabilistic demand plan and a probabilistic forecast, is that all the calculations and all the output are distributions, and you don't lose that along the way. So even if a human adds an input and says, hey, your average forecast was predicted to be 100, but I say it's going to be 150, that's a single number, the system will still translate that into a distribution. And just to show how that works, because that sounds like magic, let's assume that we have a forecast expressed as a distribution, as seen here in blue, and the middle number, the one that we're going to work off when we order our product, is the blue line in the middle. Now, we might have a forecaster, a sales rep that is historically really bad. He's providing biased data, he's got a quota to make, and he's always adjusting his forecast to be higher than what he really is. At that moment, he might make that change up. What the system will do, it will shift the change of the distribution to correct for that, right? So even though that central number is now higher, the gray one indicating here the original, and the red one, the new one, it will distort the uncertainty to say, most likely when this collaborator made this change in the past, it ended up being lower much more often than it was higher. Whereas if a reliable collaborator made the very same change, it could say, hey, this person was usually very reliable, so now that person has made the change, I'm going to skew it more to the upside. And of course, that requires not just keeping a history of your historic demand, it also requires keeping a history of your historic demand forecast, including the historical changes that collaborators made. So this is all data that every company has today. But it's a new way of looking at that data. It doesn't require any new data, just a new perspective. And so we have a way in this probabilistic view for correcting for bias. Again, this works great if you want to build resiliency against occurrences of disruptions that occur every month or every year or every couple of years. But if you properly plan in your scenarios for disruptions like a pandemic hitting in a new territory, the same approach could work there too. But the human input is still very important there. The system doesn't know what's going to happen. As a human, you're following the news, you could potentially make an inference and say, hey, let's protect ourselves from this particular type large disruption. So in conclusion, averages tend to be bad. If you work with averages, you're going to prepare yourself for an average situation. And distributions are good. It allows you to prepare for any situation, not just a 95% confidence limit, but you can determine pretty much, if I were only 90% confident, where would I put my numbers? If I was 99% confident, where would I put my numbers? So distributions give you a tremendous amount of information that you otherwise would not have had. These distributions cannot be naive. They cannot be the normal Gaussian distribution. They have to actually be fit to the data and be an appropriate representation of what happens in real life. And the normal distribution just doesn't happen in real life, no matter what people like to think. So distributions throughout, so not just the original forecast, but even after we bring in the human input, we still have distributions. And if we create plans, production plans, distribution plans, those distribution could potentially carry all the way through if you have a system that deals with that. And it's the tails of the distributions that are important. The lower tail is good for protecting yourself against things like obsolescence, but it's the upper tail that really allow us to work towards a resiliency. And then finally, it is not possible to be resilient against everything. So if you were the United States or India, you could have prepared yourself to some degree against COVID. If you were China, you couldn't. You were the first to be struck and you had no way of knowing what was coming, right? So it's impossible to be truly resilient, but you can be resilient up to a degree, and that degree is basically dependent on how far back in history are you willing to go and grab data and determine these distributions of. So hopefully that was clear. That's the end of my presentation. I don't think we have